if you are participating in today's session, unmuting, etc. Those interactions will be recorded. If you'd like to participate in today's session anonymously, go ahead and just make sure that you're answering everything in the chat. So we have a poll up right now, and we can see, based on the feedback from that poll, approximately 30% of us, right, are looking at having some knowledge, right? They're answering yes, they have some familiarity with workplace accommodations. And then we have the majority of the participants identifying that they have some, right, some familiarity with workplace accommodations. And then we have an individual who identified as not having some of that foundational knowledge or familiarity with workplace accommodations. So for those of you who are well versed in the ADA and the legal right of workplace accommodations that the ADA affords us, please feel free to share your experiences, to jump in and put things in the chat as they are applicable. And for others who also would like to share their experiences in working with individuals, again, employed or in school, feel free to put that in the chat as well. I think when we tailor the session to your specific needs, it becomes that much more meaningful. Okay, so again, we're looking at this particular agenda for today's session. And I want to throw it back to the group because I want to make sure today's session is highly applicable for you. Is there anything that you would like to cover in regard to workplace accommodations for today's session that you don't see listed under our objectives? Go ahead and put that in the chat. And as you're thinking about that, anything that you'd like to cover on today's topic, let's consider another question. What is the ADA and why is it important? What is the ADA and why do we think it's so important? Is it important? You can put that in the chat, or if you're feeling comfortable, go ahead and unmute, whatever feels good for you. We're looking at anything we want to add to our objectives for today's session, and we're going to explore what the ADA is and why is it so important. What do we think? In the work that you do in supervising supported employment or vocational staff in whatever program modality you're in, whether it's DVRS, whether it's residential services that have employment services, knowledge of the ADA is going to come into play. We operate in a field where it is important to know about these particular rights, these particular laws. So from your perspective, right, what is the ADA and why is it important? All right, we have some individuals writing in the chat. From Teresa. It gives people with other abilities freedom to have the same opportunities as others without discrimination. Teresa, I love this response. Thank you for such a wonderful reflection and overview of the Americans with Disabilities Act. It is intended to offer equity and inclusion, right, in public domains, including the public domain of workplace environments. I love this, Teresa. It gives people the opportunity to access these meaningful opportunities, these meaningful life roles without being discriminated, right? It's a document that offers civil rights. From Susan, the right to work like able-bodied persons. And I think it's important for us to know what the ADA is and be able to advocate for our clients. Susan, that's beautiful as well, right? Looking at this piece about rights. Having the legal right to be in a work environment free from discrimination, free from prejudice and harassment, because of the presence of a health condition. And you're right, it's important for us to know what the law is so that we can advocate for the people that we are supposed to be supporting, right? If we are not aware of the law, if we are not aware of what it affords and how it's applied, we cannot proceed in our advocacy role or in your staff, your SE staff's advocacy role. Awesome. Thank you. Thank you, Susan. Thank you, Teresa. So beautiful summation and thinking about what the ADA is. It's a piece of legislation that was passed in the 1990s. Initially, it has since gone through updates and several additional amendments to really underscore, as Susan and Teresa have highlighted, the right for individuals with any type of health condition that is a qualifying health condition, right? A qualifying health condition is one that ultimately impacts some form of functioning, one of a person's life domains, living, learning, working, social, impacting how they can access certain environments, certain roles with a sense of equity in relation to how others can access that environment or that role. And so we know that there are many people in our country, in our state, whether you're in Washington or like me, you're in New Jersey, that will have a qualifying health condition. And the majority of people, if not all the people that we are supporting, meet these eligibility requirements. Additional key pieces of the ADA that is important to know about in terms of how it functions in the work environment. An employer does not have to be held to the ADA requirements if they have less than 15 employees, right? So if a workplace has 15 or more employees, they are mandated to be covered, right? And they operate under the Americans with Disabilities Act. So keep that key piece of information for your staff, for yourself, as we go through today's training. But ultimately, it's a civil rights piece of legislation that is core and key in allowing people to have access to reasonable accommodations, right? Things that can help individuals be successful in the workplace setting. So when we think about reasonable accommodations and how they function in the workplace setting, they ultimately can support, as Teresa had noted, right, reducing barriers that are related to the person's health condition. And they ultimately offset, mitigate, reduce the functional implications of a health condition. Functional implications of a health condition is just a fancy way of saying, how does the health condition impact functioning in a particular environment or role? In a particular environment or role. It's less important, and we'll go over this in more detail throughout today's session. It's less important to know about someone's diagnosis, and more important when developing accommodations to know about the functional implications. What do I mean by that? So if I am working with someone who is employed and they have a mental health condition and I am their SE provider, knowing that they have schizophrenia as their diagnosis is not going to be super helpful in developing workplace accommodations. What's going to be key and integral, and we'll do some exercises in just a little bit on this topic, is looking at what symptoms they have related to their diagnosis of schizophrenia, and how do those symptoms disrupt, create barriers to functioning in the work environment. Less important to know about schizophrenia, more important to know that they experience auditory hallucinations, and that when they have auditory hallucinations, it impacts their concentration on the job site. Once I know that functional implication impacting concentration on the job site, I can start to build out accommodations that are tailored to that particular need. I see something in the chat. You only need to know specifically how to assist them in being successful. Yeah, thank you, Natalie. Yeah, we need to know what are the ways that we can provide that job coaching so that they can be successful. And a part of that could be these accommodations. When we look at accommodations and the rationale, we can also, as we're assessing for these barriers, help them to develop compensatory skills and strategies to enhance job tenure and their work performance. Compensatory skills and strategies can sometimes be workplace accommodation related. For example, a particular type of assistive technology, right? A recording device that's embedded in a pen, they're called smart pens, could be a compensatory strategy or skill. You will using the smart pen as a skill, but the strategy of using the pen during a work meeting for that person who has schizophrenia and they're hearing auditory hallucinations, that can be assistive in mitigating that concentration issue, because that compensatory strategy of using the smart pen will record the meeting so they can refer back to it when they were feeling like their concentration was decreased. So there are a whole host of ways, as Natalie identified, to know how to assist people in being successful, to offset the functional implications of their mental health condition. And we've already noted, but we have to highlight again, workers need tailored accommodations. They need tailored accommodations. That example that I provided in terms of someone with a diagnosis of schizophrenia, experiencing auditory hallucinations, right? Giving them additional work breaks, right? 5-minute increment work breaks might not be assistive for them. If they are having difficulty concentrating and the accommodation that they were given is frequent breaks, they could be getting up, leaving, not being able to concentrate further, right? So having a smart pen to help record meetings is looking specifically, right, at their needs, their existing barriers, and how to offset them. Lastly, practitioners need to be trained in what the functional implications of mental health conditions are so you can match them to the accommodation. Surprisingly, many people who are tasked, right, it falls under their purview to develop accommodations, they might not be trained in it. So we, the SE providers, the SE supervisors, have to become very skilled at this, knowing what accommodations are available, what the functional implications of the health condition are, and how to match them up. So let's do a brief knowledge check. In thinking about this whole process, who decides accommodations in the workplace setting? Go ahead and put in the chat. Who decides on workplace accommodations? You can go ahead and put that in the chat, or if you'd like, you can unmute, whatever feels right for you. Yes, so I'm seeing, oh, where to go? Natalie, oh, HR department, perfect, yes. HR department is going to come into play, awesome. That is a big piece to workplace accommodations. From Teresa, the person needing the accommodation, absolutely. This person is going to have a say in terms of what their functional implications are and the supports, right? The compensatory strategies that they could utilize to offset those. We also see doctors. Yes, there's going to be a piece in terms of a qualified practitioner, right? Licensed practitioner who is looking at developing that accommodation recommendation letter or list. Awesome. Those are the three key ingredients to who is looking to decide on accommodations. What do employers know about accommodations for workers with mental health conditions? Thinking about the workplace setting, right? The work environments that the people you're supporting currently, right? What do their employers know about accommodations for workers with mental health conditions? What do we think? You can go ahead and put that in the chat. Or if you'd like, you can answer, what are typical accommodations that are granted from your experience? You could put it in the chat, you could unmute, whatever feels good for you. But what do employers know about accommodations for workers with mental health conditions? And from your experience, what are some typical accommodations that are granted to workers with mental health conditions? What do you see? It's interesting because when you think about accommodations and typical accommodations, it's also important to consider the work environment. And we'll get into that in just a second. I've worked with people supporting individuals with mental health conditions, obtain jobs, including construction worker, including engineering positions. Someone had their master's in a specific type of documentation preservation, and so they worked at a museum, and developing those accommodations looked very different from one job site to the next. So we're looking for follow-up in terms of what employers know about accommodations and what are typical accommodations that are granted. I'm not seeing anything in the chat yet, so we'll just go ahead and reference. Oh, I am seeing something in the chat now. Sorry. Thank you, Natalie. In your experience, there are a lot of employers who don't know very much at all, other than there is a law. And we spent a lot of time providing examples of what accommodations might look like. Excellent, awesome, thank you. Thank you so much for reflecting on your practice. This is not an outlier. Your experience is not, again, just something that other people are not also reporting. We see this anecdotally, Natalie, and we see it in the literature. Employers do not have a good understanding about how to support individuals on the job site with mental health conditions. Excellent, excellent in terms of looking at what's that trend. And I'm loving that you and your staff, Natalie, are working to provide examples of accommodations from Teresa. Employers know little to nothing about accommodations. You're identifying the same thing. Yes. And sometimes shy away due to lack of knowledge. It's hard to engage in a conversation, right, Teresa, if you do not have intimate knowledge, right? There could be some hesitancy there for fear of saying something incorrect, or for other concerns. You've had former employers who worked with people with other abilities who were 100% on board and had no issues with making accommodations. Yeah, oftentimes we see that people, in terms of the employers, want to support, their employees. They're just lacking the resources, knowledge, competencies to do so. Also, people need to understand that, and accommodations also means that the person with the disability needs to be able to perform the duties of the job description with a reasonable accommodation. I love this. Thank you so much for reflecting, right, on that key piece of the formula for creating a reasonable accommodation, that essential job function or workplace function. Love that. We're going to get into that in just a second. You're saying a person who is unable to run cannot perform the job duty if part of the job requires running. Absolutely. Absolutely. We have to make sure that we are not compromising an essential function of the job. And we're going to learn all about that and where to locate your essential functions of the job to make sure that when you're developing accommodations, you are not developing accommodations that would compromise the essential functions of the job. So again, just to give a brief overview of what we discussed, accommodations are legal rights afforded by the ADA, and they are modifications, right? As I think the last person who had shared in the chat, I can't find my chat box is not opening, that it's modifications or adjustments to how things are done, how tasks get completed. We cannot modify the essential tasks, right? Those have to remain. They enable a person with a health condition and a qualifying disability to have equity and inclusion in the workplace, and include changes potentially to the application process, the interview process, to ensure equal opportunity to apply. Yeah, getting a person to understand that they cannot change the essential functions of the job is definitely a challenge. Agreed. But that falls under our purview, definitely. From Susan, some employers know that it's law, but many are not aware what those accommodations for persons whose disabilities are not physically visible struggle with how to provide those, or even whether they should. Absolutely. When we think about invisible disabilities, or also termed in the literature non-apparent health conditions, we see a huge shift, Susan, great point, in how HR, or even the Office of Disability, which is a comparable body providing accommodations in post-secondary education, right? There is a significant struggle to develop accommodations that can offset those invisible disabilities, right? For example, a person on medication that impairs their physical performance might not get an accommodation because the employer doesn't see a need. Right, exactly. Absolutely. So again, reasonable accommodations are modifications, adjustments to the task, the environment, or the way that things are done that enable the person with the health condition, with the mental health condition, to participate in work. Broad categories of accommodations include changes to the application process to ensure equal opportunity that a person can apply, right? I'm going to forward the slide. So changes to the application process so that the person can apply to enter a job opportunity, changes that enable them to ultimately complete work tasks effectively, efficiently, and ultimately enjoy equal benefits and privileges. And accommodations should be determined by looking at how those symptoms impact performing critical skills needed, essential functions of the workplace environment. We're always looking at essential functions. Home Depot is a great example for a person on medication could impair the function of running a forklift or other equipment. I have had issues with trying to get someone a job at Home Depot. Yeah, so that is a wonderful example, thinking about, right, functional implications and how medication might impact that specific job task of operating a forklift. And so how do you accommodate that? Can it be accommodated, or is running that forklift a key duty of that job, right? Which brings us so very nicely into our next slide. How do we know what essential functions of a job are? Where do we find them, right? Essential functions are the tasks and duties that must be completed. They're the reason that the job exists, right? They cannot be modified, and the ADA does not relieve an employee from the obligation to perform them. for work or school. The ADA ultimately is intended to help a person compete in the workplace based on the same requirements, the same performance standards, right? The presence of a health condition or disability cannot lower standards or requirements. That cannot be removed in terms of an accommodation, right? Removing a work standard or work requirement. Accommodations cannot modify the what, essential functions. Accommodations can modify the how. And you can find all of your essential functions to your job on your job description. If you look up your job description, there will be a list of the deliverables, job duties, as well as maybe some indicators of performance listed on your job description. Those are all the key and critical, right, pieces of the job, the essential functions of the job. So let's see if we can drive this point home. Two people you're working with are on medications that ultimately provide photosensitivity as a side effect, right? They're sensitive to light. This particular medication, when they're taking it, can ultimately result in frequent sunburns very easily. They are experiencing sunburn when they're outside in the light. They're the one person that you're working with, person A, is going for a job as a mail person. They are going to be delivering mail. They get the job. And they're asking you if they could have an accommodation where on the sunny days, because of their medication side effect, on the sunny days, they don't have to deliver mail. Now, person B that you're working with is an administrative assistant. And someone on their team is out on, let's say, maternity leave. And that person typically goes out and delivers the mail. But since they are not, right, they go out and deliver the mail for, let's say, this like big company. And so they're outside sometimes, going to and from these office units delivering mail. And the administrative assistant was asked if they could go do this and spend, an hour or two outside delivering mail. They have asked for a letter, right, for an accommodation to not deliver this mail. Let's check in. Can person A, right, the person that obtained the job as a mail person, can they get the accommodation to not deliver the mail during sunny days? Go ahead and put that in the chat. I'm seeing from Natasha, no. What does everyone else think? Say no. No. Anyone else? No's are correct, right? If you look at the essential functions, those job duties for a mail person, it's going to be, right, they have to deliver the mail. And so requesting an accommodation to not deliver the mail is ultimately going to impact the essential functions. What about person B? Person B, who is administrative assistant. Could they get this request to not deliver this mail? Natasha, yes. Yes, yes, yes. How come? You are correct. You're 100% correct. They could get this accommodation. Why? Why could they get this accommodation? What do we think? Yeses are correct. Natasha, delivering mail is not an essential function. Yes, Natalie. Yes, Teresa, it's not an essential function. Awesome. You guys are pros at this. Great. So this is, in a nutshell, how we go about looking at essential functions. And essential functions in the job environment is ultimately the employment implication. The employment implication of a mental health condition is how the related symptom affects the worker in the work setting, outside of the work setting, doing work-related duties, in completing the tasks of the job, right? And so when we're looking at the employment implication, functional implication in the workplace setting, right? It will vary by environment. It will vary by job description, and will vary by the nature of the condition. These are all core ingredients in looking at, are we developing a reasonable accommodation? Not essential function. Awesome. We're all on the same page. So thinking about this, you're always going to want to train your staff, and you'll get the recording from today's session. You'll get the PowerPoint. So you'll be able to utilize this to train your staff on how to develop accommodations. But you'll want your staff, or you yourself, if you're providing direct service, to be able to look at these key ingredients, right, in developing an accommodation. What's their work environment? Where's that job description for their essential functions? Nature of the condition, so we can get an understanding of the employment implications, right? What are those functional implications in the workplace setting? And it's also important to consider when you're building accommodations, the spectrum of the person's mental health condition. Consider your own mental health and wellness, or the mental health wellness of the individuals you're providing services to. How does it vacillate? Are there naturally, right, thinking about mental health and wellness, there naturally is a spectrum. There are peaks and valleys for every individual, especially for individuals with pre-existing mental health conditions. Symptoms are symptoms are not always going to be in one particular end of the spectrum. It vacillates. This is important to note, because when you're developing accommodations, you're going to want to develop accommodations to support the person when they're experiencing moderate symptoms to severe symptoms. So we want to build workplace accommodations to be supportive of an individual when they are experiencing the full range of symptoms, right? When symptoms are more severe. This can be hard for people to conceptualize because, and this goes back to, at times, that conversation of physical disability versus invisible disabilities, right? Observable disabilities, apparent disabilities versus non-apparent disabilities. Some of the nature of non-apparent disabilities could be that symptoms are going to vacillate. I'm thinking about your mental health conditions. I'm thinking about autism spectrum disorder. I'm thinking about even something like multiple sclerosis or diabetes, and how there is this ebb and flow of symptoms. Whereas if someone has a physical disability, where there's a visual impairment, a hearing impairment, where there is mobility needs, right? Those accommodations are typically developed to that person's more frequent need of services and supports. Whereas we tend to see and observe anecdotally, and we also identify in the literature, that with these non-apparent conditions, people might be developing accommodations based on some of these more mild, moderate stages. So moving forward, what do you think are the benefits to developing accommodations to meet the needs of a person when they're experiencing a more higher frequency of symptom, a more higher severity of symptom. What do you think are the benefits to that? Go ahead and put that in the chat. What are the benefits to developing accommodations to meet the full spectrum of symptoms? It is customizable to the needs of the person. Awesome. Love that. Right. So there are options for that person to utilize their accommodations based on where their symptom needs are at. If they don't need to use it at a particular time, that's fine, but it's there when they do need to use it, Natasha. It allows them to continue working and miss less work. Absolutely. The process of completing an accommodation request is lengthy at times. And so if we go through the process of assisting somebody in getting accommodations, and the accommodations that were developed were only developed to meet mild symptoms and not their more severe symptoms, when those severe symptoms come, they have nothing in place. It's not there. It's not embedded in their accommodations at that point. And we have to then go back to square one in requesting additional accommodations, right? Requesting additional accommodations can sometimes start the process over again, so to speak, and getting information from the provider for additional accommodations, etc. So thinking about this process of developing accommodations, well, you know what, let's take one step back. Let's talk about the process of applying for accommodations. Because I want to make sure that everyone is very clear in terms of workplace setting. How do we support individuals in getting accommodations? First and foremost, we spoke about HR, the person that's the job seeker or the worker, as well as a licensed practitioner. These three particular individuals are going to be integral in applying for and securing accommodations. So you want to look at, does the employer have 15 or more employees? Are they beholden to the ADA? Sometimes job sites, employers that have less than 15 employees are still open to honoring accommodations and supporting individuals in that regard. So always check that out first. The person that is working with the health condition is going to want to chat with human resources first and foremost. Human resources is going to be the point person in navigating the accommodation requests and application. Not the supervisor, not the colleague, the only point person within a workplace setting that gets full disclosure of the nature of the health condition is going to be human resources, right? As per the ADA, that job seeker, that worker with the health condition, with the mental health condition, never has to disclose the nature of their disability to their supervisor or to their coworkers. Their coworkers need not even know that they have accommodations. All of that gets funneled through human resources. And what you're providing, or you're supporting that person in providing to human resources, is a letter from a licensed practitioner. This can be a counselor, this can be a social worker, this can be a psychiatrist, this could be a primary care physician that identifies that the person has a qualifying disability, the nature of that disability, and what accommodations they need. It's essentially a letter, right, that looks at key ingredients of requesting accommodations: the diagnosis and the requested reasonable accommodations, right? And how do we develop those reasonable accommodations that will be on this letter? This is the process here. right? So how is the worker's daily functioning affected by the presence of their mental health condition? What specifically in their environment of work is going on with the mental health condition? What barriers does the mental health condition cause? What side effects are present due to medication and treatment? And how do these limitations affect that job seeker or that worker and their ability to perform their job in the environment? I mentioned the person with auditory hallucinations, right? They're hearing these voices frequently throughout the day, and it impacts their concentration. So impacting concentration might affect taking notes during meeting, listening to a supervisor's instructions or feedback, ability to engage in meetings, etc. Accommodations are not considered reasonable when, first and foremost, they pose a direct threat to the health, safety, or learning environment of others, right? That can never be compromised. Making the accommodation would require a substantial change in essential elements of the curriculum if you're in the academic setting, or if you're in the workplace setting, the essential functions of the job. Or it poses an undue financial burden to the employer or to the school setting. Side note, most accommodations cost very little money, if not any money at all. Most accommodations are very cost effective and to the benefit of the worker as well as the employer, because it helps the person to successfully complete their work. So here's another example of this particular approach in action. Functional implication, work implication is screening out external distractions. Screening out external distractions can be related to a multitude of diagnoses, from PTSD, right, that hyperarousal, to anxiety, OCD, to even bipolar disorder. There's a lot of overlap in terms of functional implications in varying diagnoses. That's why I noted it's important to note the functional implication versus the DSM code or the ICD code, right? So what does that mean? Inability to black out signs, sights, or odors. Barriers that it causes: worker might not be able to concentrate in the meeting. Worker might not be able to focus on reports in a high traffic area, right? They can't have their desk in a high traffic area. Or coworkers keep interrupting a worker when they're entering their data for their data report. So one of the best ways to really explore this process and this process in relation to specific mental health diagnoses is using the Job Accommodations Network. And that's acronym JAN, Job Accommodations Network. I'm going to have you guys go out into breakout groups for the next 5 minutes. I'm going to create 2 groups. Group 1, I'd like you to go to the Job Accommodations Network and look up how to support a worker with anxiety disorders. And group 2, I'd like you to go to the Job Accommodations website and look up how to support a worker with a diagnosis of major depressive disorder. Okay, we'll spend the next 5 minutes going to those websites in our breakout groups to get an understanding of how to use the Job Accommodations Network. This is a free resource that breaks down. You can support people with various health conditions, including mental health conditions. It's free, easily accessible. You can do phone calls, chats, as well as use their website, JAN, to find, almost like Google, how to develop accommodations for people with mental health conditions or other health conditions. I'm going to open those rooms up now. See you back in a few minutes.